Good evening, everyone. I'm Ben Moore. I'm with the guest experience team here at the Filson Historical Society, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's program. Now it's my honor to introduce tonight's speaker. Independent scholar Eve Kahn is a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the magazine Antiques, and Apollo magazine, covering art, architecture, history, and design. Her 2019 biography of the Connecticut-born globe-trotting painter Mary Rogers Williams from Wesleyan University Press won awards from institutions including the Connecticut League of History organizations. Tonight, we are thrilled to have Eve with us to discuss her latest work. So please join me in giving Eve a warm Filson welcome.
Thank you. Thank you to the whole amazing Filson team. Thanks to everyone for coming. I am kicking off 4 months of book tour for my new book about Zoe Anderson Norris tonight here. This is the kickoff. Actually, no, that secretly I gave a U of L lecture at noontime today. And flukishly, someone in the audience is a descendant of a friend of Zoe Anderson Norris. I am so happy to be here, this gorgeous space, this fascinating institution. I am meeting and making connections with all kinds of old friends and new friends and great scholars, and I'm thrilled to be here. So I'm going to talk for half an hour-ish about the twists and turns of fate that brought Zoe Anderson Norris from rural Kentucky to rural New York's Bohemia and to fight for the poor with her pen. And she wrote millions of words of fiction and journalism, and Kentucky recurred throughout her work. It influenced her to the end of her days. So she was born in 1860 in Harrodsburg, which everyone knows is a half an hour-ish southwest of Lexington by modern driving standards. She was the 13th of 15 children of Henry Tompkins Anderson and Henrietta Ducker Anderson. Her father, Henry, lived from 1812 to 1872. Her mother lived from 1819 to 1897. Her father's ancestors had come to Virginia in the 17th century. And in the early 19th century, they came to Kentucky with a wave of other Virginians coming here. Her mother's ancestors, the Duckers, there's a hamlet near Frankfort named after them. They had come to Kentucky from Maryland and ended up in Hopkinsville, the 13th of 15 children. So her father had converted as a young man to the Disciples of Christ, one of the many evangelical faiths that were sweeping this region. Before Zoe was born, he had worked as a pastor with various postings, including in Louisville, and there were a couple of different churches here that he worked for. By the time she was born in Harrodsburg in 1860, he wasn't earning any money. He was focused on translating the New Testament again from ancient Greek through the lens of the Disciples of Christ, making minor variations on past translations. He published a couple editions of it, which you're seeing at top left. There was a publisher in Louisville, publisher in Cincinnati, a publisher in the UK, but he never made much money at it. It was about $1.50 an edition, which was a luxury at that time. And there was a flood of cheap Bibles after the Civil War. His edition couldn't compete. Zoe, you can see her as a steely, determined little girl at lower left. She grew up at what she would later describe as the ragged edge of poverty. Both her parents were very well educated, Henry particularly. He was fluent not only in ancient Greek, but also in Hebrew and Latin. That level of erudition was only possible in the American South before the Civil War, as everyone in this room knows, because enslaved Black people had done a lot of the hard work around Zoe's family homes. At the beginning of my book, there's a tribute page along these lines. I've excavated as many names as I can find of people enslaved by branches of her family in not only in Kentucky, but also in Virginia and Missouri. It's because of their labors in captivity that the cultured milieu she grew up in was possible. So her writing style, her wit, her vocabulary, it was all in a sense made possible, partly possible by enslaved labor. So my research, my writing, my book, my talk here tonight, in a sense, were made possible by the labors of these people in captivity, as many names as I could find. More were surfacing even as I was finishing the book manuscript. So at lower left, that's the farmhouse or a farmhouse, we're not sure, at the outskirts of Harrodsburg where she was born. She called it a little old dog kennel town. That's how she described it by 1900 when she became a committed New Yorker. She never stopped writing about the beauties of velvety bluegrass country, and I fell in love with it. I've been there twice. I'm going back again in November. I took a dried, the local historian gave me a dried sprig of bluegrass, which I've been carrying around in my notebook for years now. She also wrote vividly about the Shaker community that wasn't far from her family home. Top left is it's the plantation near Fredericksburg, Virginia, where Stonewall Jackson had died during the Civil War after being mortally wounded by accident by his own men. Around Fredericksburg and that plantation, Zoe's family lived around 1870 or so when her father was in failing health. He had close relatives living nearby, and it's possible they were helping him and Henrietta with their enormous brood of children. Zoe wrote vividly about the Civil War experience, particularly the Kentucky veterans after the war. She wrote vividly about men who had known during battle that they might be killing off their own relatives. She had relatives who fought for the federal forces and relatives who fought for the Confederacy. In one case, she wrote a short story about a man who was a veteran of Perryville and had absolutely no idea during the chaos of battle which side was winning and who he was killing. These are some of her 14 siblings and their spouses. I'm not going to go into any salient detail about any of them. It would take up the rest of our time here this evening. 12 of them survive to adulthood, 10 of them marry and have children. It's an enormous family. I've kept introducing cousins to each other who had no idea each other existed. It's a huge family, and they scattered widely. They ended up in Hopkinsville, Kansas, Chicago, and a number of them became portrait painters and photographers. It's a creative entrepreneurial family bent on documenting the world. But Zoe's the only member of the family who decided that writing might be a profitable way. Putting words on the page, as her father had done, might be a profitable way to earn a living. In the center of the lower row has got to be the best photo ever taken in Harrodsburg of a boy and his dog. That was taken by one of her brothers who ended up in Hopkinsville. And there was a sister who lived on Fountain Court in Louisville. That's how huge and that's how connected the family was to this entire state. They were scattered. After her father's death in 1872, she was sent to an elite girls' boarding school, Daughters College in Harrodsburg. There's some ephemera. There's a brochure and a photo from there over in that beautiful case. Daughters College. Many of you have been there because it's the Beaumont Inn. It's beautifully preserved and it's full of memorabilia from when it was Daughters College. Literally photographs of the girls and the faculty, and there's memorabilia related to the curriculum, everything there. It's fascinating. The head of the school, John Augustus Williams, had been a good friend of Zoe's father. It's possible John Augustus Williams gave her a break on the tuition because it was an expensive school and her family didn't have any money. He sternly told the students, do not marry until you have developed enough professional skill, perhaps as a stenographer or a teacher, that you can support your family if the male breadwinners that you're counting on fail you. And Zoe didn't listen to him. She married in 1878 at age 18, days after graduation, like an idiot. And I'm quoting a memoir essay she wrote just before her death in 1914. She married like an idiot Spencer Norris. He had been born in Missouri, but he grew up in Harrodsburg. His family had deep Kentucky roots that I can tell you about if you're curious how many generations back his family went in Kentucky. He worked over the years as a storekeeper, a restaurant owner, a hotel manager. Zoe wrote over the years about women who married down, women from intellectual families who married working class men. Zoe wrote, even her most imaginative fiction is incredibly autobiographical. So, Spencer Norris, he was by all accounts brutally handsome, and he was by Zoe's account incredibly spoiled by his overbearing mother. He was the only surviving child of a woman who'd been widowed young. They marry in 1878. They quickly have two children, a son named Rob and a daughter named Clarence. And they soon move to Wichita, Kansas. Many people are going from Kentucky to Kansas to make their fortune at the frontier. And he runs a series of specialty grocery stores in Wichita. That's him and his delivery wagon on the left. But by the 1880s, a number of Zoe's siblings and her widowed mother have joined them in Kansas. They go to homestead at the frontier on land besieged by cyclones, droughts, locusts, terrible isolation, and constant wind. They would have lived in a dugout like you're seeing at top right. Right, people, there's no building materials until the railroad comes in. People are literally digging themselves holes in the ground to live in and making an entryway for it out of blocks of sod or stone. The family farm fails, and Zoe's mother, Henrietta, begins to go mad at the frontier. And she's sent to Eastern State Asylum in Lexington, where she dies. Zoe never stopped writing about the terrors of homesteading in Kansas, and she never stopped writing about her terror of being institutionalized against her will. That's her son, Rob, on the left, and of the pair of girls on the right, that's her daughter, Clarence. That photo on the right was taken at the Catholic Girls' School in Bardstown. These were taken around 1898. That's when Zoe was granted a divorce from Spencer on the grounds of his admitted adultery. Zoe and a friend from Harrodsburg, who'd also moved to Wichita to make his fortune, they walked in on Spencer in flagrante with a blonde. And Zoe was granted a divorce quite easily. Before the divorce, she'd been a neglected, unhappy housewife, and she began to experiment with fiction and journalism as simply a way to earn some pocket money as well. And her writings of that period include a vicious gossip column for a Wichita newspaper. With the divorce in 1898, that flow of words becomes a fire hose, and it doesn't end until her death. She needs it to support herself. Her son is not a miner anymore. Rob stays in Kansas and becomes a railroad executive. She ends up largely estranged from him. Her daughter, Clarence, she gets custody of, and they flee Wichita. Zoe had hated it there. She thought that Kansans were vastly inferior to their cultured Kentucky counterparts. These are illustrations from some of her first stories in national publications. On the left is a portrait of Zoe from a short story she wrote about a Kansas cowgirl who's killed by a cyclone. She was crouching under a tree trying to protect her lover from the force of the storm, and the tree bough kills her, and he survives. The center image is from Zoe's travelogue about visiting Colorado and being on the porch of a hotel and overhearing a man dismiss Southerners like her as inherently lazy. And she decides to prove him wrong by climbing Pikes Peak, wearing nothing but thin silk slippers on her feet. And she brings back down to the hotel her torn apart shoes as evidence of her achievement. And on the right is from a short story she wrote about a woman living in Kansas who hates her mother-in-law back in Kentucky, but is dutifully writing a letter inviting the mother-in-law to spend time with them in Kansas, dreading the experience, longing for the aid of opiates to survive time with her mother-in-law. This is apparently based on Zoe's real-life relationship with Spencer's overbearing mother. Zoe never stopped skewering people she knew in print. 1899, 1900, Zoe and Clarence flee to Europe, and the Fire Hose of Words is all about American women traveling in Europe. The story on the illustration on the left is from a short story about an American woman flirting with a handsome Scotsman on a ferry crossing the English Channel. And he tells her to stop writing so much. He tells her to just enjoy herself sometimes and not always be taking notes for her next story. The center image is from a short story nationally syndicated about a woman from Kentucky who goes to a hotel in Switzerland, and she realizes that there's a Swiss woman sitting by the window hopelessly, waiting for the cad from Harrodsburg, the tourist man who'd come to visit Switzerland and said that he was in love with her and that he would come back and whisk her away from Switzerland to the States someday. That's the woman sitting hopelessly by the window. The American tourist visiting, the woman sitting on the left, looking over pityingly at the woman by the window. That woman knows that that man is married and has children back in Harrodsburg and is never coming back to Switzerland. Top right is Zoe's photo taken at the World's Fair in 1900 in Paris. On the fairgrounds, her daughter Clarence meets a handsome Brit named Harold Morris, who's billed as a fabulously wealthy silk tycoon, but he's actually a deadbeat gambler and adulterer. So just as Zoe had married disastrously as a teenager, her daughter Clarence proceeds to marry disastrously as a teenager. Clarence and Harold Morris quickly have a son named Robert, and Clarence ends up stuck in London for years, trying to get out of Harold's clutches, get custody of the boy, and get back to the States. By 1901 or so, Zoe is based in New York and she basically never leaves again. She makes a handful of trips back to Kentucky and Kansas to see relatives, and then she writes stories about New York women eking out a living as writers who go to visit their families in Kansas and Kentucky and find them boring or provincial or scornful and never want to see them again, basically. I love her though. So the illustration on the left is from a story about a woman, a freelance writer who has deformed her thumb. She has typed so many stories that magazines reject, and a reliable suitor comes to rescue the woman on the left. On the right is from a short story about a woman writer who's more successful than her writer boyfriend. And he calls her work trite and depressing, and he storms out in a fit of jealousy. Zoe wrote a lot of love stories that end happily. About 2/3 of her many, many stories about love end happily, so that they were saleable, unlike her own experiences in love. In 1902, she reaches her first peak of literary fame. She publishes a novel, The Color of His Soul. It's about a woman freelance writer from the South living in Harlem, which is where Zoe was living at that time, who unmasks a Harlem neighbor as a hypocrite. He's a prominent, her name is Dolly, and his character's name is Cecil Mallon. Dolly realizes that Cecil Mallon, a charismatic socialist orator who preaches sympathy for the wage slaves of the world, actually has a teenage mistress. She's a seamstress. When she gets pregnant, he abandons her and she dies in childbirth in a charity hospital. This novel debuts to rave reviews, and days later, an actual hypocritical predator socialist orator that Zoe knows from Wichita, who's living in Harlem, named Courtney Lemon, surfaces and says, I'm obviously the role model for this horrible character, Cecil Mallon. I never impregnated anyone who died in a charity hospital. He threatens lawsuits, and Funk and Wagnalls is a quite conservative publisher, and they yank the book from the market. Zoe is devastated by this, but she eventually manages to find a less prestigious publisher to re-release the book. Threat to pretty girl novelist was one of the headlines during the legal wranglings. She's 42 and a grandmother when she gets called a pretty girl, but I suspect it bothered her less than you might think. By 1902, she's shaved 5-7 years off of her age. She eventually shaves a full 10 years off of her age. So she might have actually enjoyed being called a pretty girl novelist. Can you just make out the initials JKB at the bottom of the cover and the title page? That stands for John Kennedy Bryan's, Jack Bryan's as he was known. He was the illustrator of her first book. And then he became her second husband. He was 12 years younger than she is, and I don't think he ever finds out how old she actually is. He's a prolific artist of silhouettes, mostly humorous. He gets them printed on postcards. He illustrates a book for a Black author, fascinating man named James Carruthers, who hasn't had a good biography yet, who's a good friend of his and Zoe's. He illustrates the cover of her second novel, The Quest of Polly Locke, which is about a Southern woman traveling alone in Europe, of course. The cover image that he provided, that's the title character at the base of Mount Vesuvius, right? Can you just make out the steam from the volcano tip at the horizon? So the marriage seems to sour quickly. She begins to write in her fiction and journalism about how boring it is to be married to a humorist, to watch someone grind out fun all day long, and also how creative, successful women get drained by their less creative, less successful husbands. They don't ever formally divorce, as far as I could tell. In one of her stories, a woman runs into her estranged husband on the streets, and he basically says, I either want to reconcile or I want a formal divorce. And she says, or she replies, I definitely don't want to reconcile. Not only are you boring, but you're not successful, and you're constantly criticizing me when we live together. But I don't want a formal divorce. That would make me vulnerable to marrying again. And she adds, looking him dead in the eye, I have bad taste in men. So by 1904, 1905, 1906, her daughter Clarence manages to get out of London with Zoe's grandson, Robert Morris. They move in with Zoe. Jack hates children, and I can document this because some nice person at a courthouse in New Jersey sent me his first divorce proceedings. He hated children. Zoe definitively kicks him out when her family moves in with her. She supports the family with a fire hose, particularly of newspaper journalism. She walks the perimeter of Manhattan for the New York Times, and she writes down hauntingly memorable details like little kids picking their way alone along the waterfront with sacks of kindling on their back. They're picking up bits of wood that they're going to need to burn in the wood stoves in their unheated tenement apartments in the winter. The New York Sun sends her out to interview all the most prominent zoo animals in town. And the tortoise complains that all anybody wants to know is how old his wife is, and she hates that question. And the hippo complains that every time I open my mouth, even, I make a sensation, I get all this unwanted attention. And she tells the hippo, just be glad you're not a woman journalist, because then when you open your mouth, you really get in trouble. But when she's in the Bronx, a farmer offers her some strawberries, and they sit together on his porch. And he reminds her of her neighbors in Harrodsburg. She said in Harrodsburg, a man might come for tea on Sunday and stay for 23 years. Kentucky hospitality. So for the New York Sun, and then eventually a national syndication, and then gathered into her third book, she writes 12 Kentucky Colonel stories. The narrator is based on one of her in-laws in Harrodsburg, a scoundrel, trigger-happy politician named Philip Burton Thompson. I have mounds of information on him if you're curious. So these 12 stories are mostly about feuds, because as everyone in this room knows, you used to be able to get away with murder in broad daylight in Kentucky if you could prove to a jury that it was an affair of honor, or Anna, H-O-N-N-A-H, is how this character puts it in a heavy Kentucky accent. The whole book is told it's almost unintelligible to someone who's never heard a Kentucky accent. Cars, kyars, it's like C-Y-A-H is for car, kya. So some of the feuds that this Kentucky Colonel rattles off, they're based on real life feuds that broke out in and around Harrodsburg. And some of them are obviously imaginary. In one case, a bitter feud breaks out after one man's mother-in-law is shot in the arm by accident during a gunfight. And two clans try to exterminate each other, and the cemeteries pile up with, the epitaphs all say, martyrs to the cause of the mother-in-law. And of course, at the end of the story, you find out that the reason the feud is so bitter is that man hated his mother-in-law and wanted her killed outright instead of simply injured. Oh, wait, so no, definitely not. Are you seeing that too? Yes. There we go. So 1906, 1907, 1908, she supports her family with a fire hose of words, particularly about newspaper journalism about immigrant neighborhoods. She goes deeper and deeper into the Italian immigrant neighborhoods and the Eastern European Jewish neighborhoods. People tell her they're dangerous, but she gets more and more fascinated by them. She sees the little mothers, the little fathers of these neighborhoods. Those are the 3, 4, and 5-year-olds who were expected to stay home and take care of their infant siblings while their parents were out working in sweatshops. She sees little kids pushing baby carriages who can't see over the handlebars. But she also comes to admire the resourcefulness of the poor, that they can take a doorway, a stairwell, and turn it into a thriving pickle stand. That's her daughter Clarence at left, and the boy on the right in that row is her grandson, Robert Morris. By 1908 or so, Clarence has spent enough time back in Kentucky that she's fallen in requited love with a farmer, a seed company owner back in Harrodsburg, and she marries him, and she brings little Robert to be raised in Harrodsburg. Without them, Zoe is bereft, and she's also lost a lot of jobs because she's stood her ground against male editors, and she's been fired from a number of places. She falls into poverty, and she ends up in a charity hospital. She's delirious. She's convinced the staff would kill her, except they realized she's a well-known writer. In 1909, she pulls herself together. She has some diamond jewelry remaining, and she pawns it. And she announces to the world, I'm going to try and be my own boss now. She founds a bi-monthly magazine called The East Side. By then, she's living on East 15th Street on the Lower East Side between 1st and 2nd Avenue. She's on the 7th floor of a newish building. Her apartment faces south. She overlooks a sea of desperate immigrant poverty that stretches basically all the way to City Hall. And she writes in her own magazine and her own press release, I've got enough material observing just looking out my window to last me the rest of my writing days. I've weaseled my way into the apartment where she lived. I pretended to be renting it for my daughter. I tried to get in, but honestly, I emailed the owner saying I'm researching a famous person who lived here. No response. I had to use Street Easy. I know Zoe forgives me. That's her brochure on the left. She gets blurbs early on from celebrities, including David Starr Jordan, the first president of Stanford, and Elbert Hubbard, fascinating philosopher, tastemaker, who ran a utopian arts and crafts community in Western New York. She announces, I'm going to write virtually every word in my own magazine. I'm tired of being told what to do by men. By then, her male editors have plagiarized her, stiffed her on fees, sexually harassed her, accused her of various misdeeds. She not only writes every word virtually, she gives herself all the masthead titles, and she changes them with every issue. And they include, over the years, Bootblack, Circulation Liar, The Whole Cheese, and The Whole Shebang. She lists all these ever-changing masthead titles next to a big bracket pointing at the name Zoe Anderson Norris. 29 issues every other month from 1909 until her death in 1914. She finds an illustrator named William Oberhart. He's willing to work for her for free. He's an up-and-comer. He's incredibly talented. She can only pay him by sharing with him her press passes to theater and musicals. He loves Broadway shows, and she brings him with her. And that's how she rewards him for illustrating all 29 issues of her magazine. And whatever she's writing about, he's following her around the slums and illustrating. So gaunt, exhausted child laborers and bewildered, traumatized new arrivals at Ellis Island, the peddlers and all their different wares. She goes to synagogue services, and he somehow sneaks into a synagogue's women's gallery. Can you see that second from left? I don't know how a male illustrator got into the sexually segregated, the gender segregated section of the synagogue during services. You can see their glamorous hats. So that's second from left. She writes about rabbis she becomes friends with, including social justice activists, and he provides a portrait of a rabbi for one of her covers. For all the inequities she's seeing in New York, she loves the city. She loves the boulders of skyscrapers with windows flashing back the fire of the sun, and rising over the tenements and sweeping away the pushcart peddlers. She sees men, women, children tottering under enormous burdens, being handed cups full of water as if they were animals. She sees peddlers getting into arguments to control a particularly well-trafficked corner on the curb. She begs for basic government reforms for her neighborhood. Can we get the trash cans emptied down here so they don't spread deadly disease the way we can in richer neighborhoods right nearby? Can we impose sensible alimony laws so that a man can't simply move to New Jersey and not be responsible for paying any alimony or child support to his family left starving and freezing in New York? She visits the families of the victims of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. In 1911, 146, mostly teenage girls, either immigrants from Eastern Europe or Italy, were killed in a matter of minutes because the factory doors were locked by owners trying to prevent the workers from taking breaks or stealing anything. She goes to visit the families of the victims, and she documents how they are broken by heartbreak and they are falling deeper into poverty because these girls were their breadwinners. She writes about herself, her beauty treatments, her bad marriages, her life in Kansas, Kentucky. She wraps herself in shawls, and she borrows an accordion and she attaches a cup to it to report undercover about what it's really like to be poor and how do you get treated by philanthropists and passersby. She plays music on the streets of the Lower East Side and begs. Rich philanthropists that she recognizes walk right past her, and other beggars give her money. She writes about this undercover reporting experience. She is very honest about her failings as an undercover reporter. One of the few songs she can play is My Old Kentucky Home. She does not make a persuasive immigrant beggar on the streets. And she writes about this. She makes fun of herself in her own magazine. She gets written about as being an unusual example of a woman running her own magazine. At lower left, that's a portrait of her that appeared with a nationally syndicated profile. You may be able to just make out, I know it's blurry, over her typewriter, there was a sign, "This is my busy day," it said. And she often wrote about the physical acts that went into getting your own magazine out, typing things up, bringing it to the incompetent typesetter, bringing the printed pages to the incompetent bookbinder, who then mangled it with fiendish crookedness, she wrote. And then she got written about for writing about writing. And then she wrote about what it had been like to be interviewed and then written about for writing about writing. So I stand before you, a woman writer writing about a woman writer who wrote about being written about for writing about writing. The layers, they just keep piling up. she's one of hundreds of dreamers in her time who found their own small, literally, about most of them are about 4 by 6 inches magazines. They're all underfinanced, understaffed, and they're told from the viewpoint of one strongly opinionated owner or editor. Zoe's magazine comes out every other month for nearly 5 years, 29 issues. Many of her competitors, they come out so erratically that they're known among scholars today not as periodicals, but as sporadicals. So one of the few other women pursuing this unprofitable trade is Emma Goldman, right? The great firebrand anarchist whose Mother Earth magazine was headquartered not far from Zoe's apartment / office. But Mother Earth printed contributions by multiple authors, and Zoe wrote virtually every word herself. They all charge about 10 cents per issue. $1 a year got you a subscription. For $10, you could be one of Zoe's life preservers. And she would list your name alongside her ever-changing masthead titles. You'd be known as a life preserver. If you only gave her $5, you'd be a half-life preserver. The people running these magazines would get in spats with each other. One would insult a competitor in the Jan-Feb issue and then get insulted back in someone else's May-June issue. So they're like modern-day bloggers, but there's this long time delay in between the insult and the retort. So for example, lower left, the Open Road magazine. That was run by a guy named Bruce Calvert, who lived in rural Indiana. Pigeon Roost in the Woods was the name of his home and office. He excoriated Zoe and anyone like-minded for loving to live in cities. He said any city dweller is a blind mole in an underworld of darkness. And Zoe wrote back to him, Bruce Calvert, I grew up in the Kentucky countryside. Everything I could gain from there, I've got it better in New York. I've got the giant boulders of skyscrapers and the stream of humanity coursing in between. The forests of Central Park are better than anything I'd find on any mountaintop because they're kept company by the lights of the apartment buildings along the perimeter of the park. Bruce Calvert, I grew up going on picnics in the Kentucky riverbanks, and all I ever got there was poison ivy. Even as she begs for basic government reforms, she doesn't want to be pigeonholed as a shrill reformer. And she wants to draw more people to her causes and attract more subscribers by occasionally having some fun. So every Wednesday or Thursday night at a different New York restaurant, she has a blowout dinner party for her friends that are called the Ragged Edge Klub with a K. They are dedicated to the killing of care with a K, with comfortable with a K, exclusiveness, the killing of care, the Ragged Edge Klub. There's no constitution, no membership directory, no dues, no motions to adjourn, just the killing of care every Wednesday or Thursday. And she doesn't pay for everybody. Everybody has to pay their own way because she's falling into poverty, writing about the poor. It's a fascinating group of people. She writes about them in her magazine, and they include performers, reformers, writers, artists, filmmakers, physicians, businessmen, just curious about life on the Lower East Side. She writes about them in her magazine, and with those sort of biographical crumbs, often when I dug deeper into these people's stories, I realized, oh, that's not their real name. They're on the run from a scandal in their conservative small hometown, and they've had to reinvent themselves in New York. There's no paperwork for the Ragged Edge Klub except for Zoe's invitations. That at the left, next to the trash can, it says, kindly put the humble hostess wise. There were no RSVPs required. Sometimes she had absolutely no idea how many people were going to show up. And they dance like dervishes. They dance between meal courses. They don't wait until the end of dinner to dance. And some of the music they dance to, they had a semi-staff pianist, a black ragtime composer and musician named Harry Huggs. I found some of his gorgeously illustrated sheet music in the copyright files at the Library of Congress. And I buy her Ragged Edge Friends sheet music whenever I can find it on eBay. This is a partial collection of music composed or performed by friends of hers. You see a recurring image of a woman with great hair, great hats, a photo in either in a square or an oval or a rondelle. That's Libby Blondell. She was a friend of Zoe's from Wichita who moved to New York. She was a vaudeville star. That's not her real name. Bluestein was her first husband's real last name. He went on to marry again, and his daughter was the actress Joan Blondell. That's one of Zoe's brushes with actual celebrity over the years. Libby Blondell, sometimes she put an E on it, and sometimes she didn't at the end. It didn't matter how she spelled it. It was a fake name anyway. Blondella. At the bottom, there's Golden Grain Choreography. That was published by Zoe's friend Louis Shalif. He was a Russian Jewish immigrant. He was the dance master of the Ragged Edge Klub. He ran the Temple to Terpsichore School near Carnegie Hall. The Ragged Edgers wanted to learn all the latest dance moves, including the airship quadrille and the banana peel slide. The banana peel slide required a yellow gown with a high slit up the hip and white tights underneath that showed as you flowed across the dance floor. The banana peel slide. And this is a fraction of my collection of souvenir postcards from the Ragged Edgers' favorite restaurants, mostly on the Lower East Side, mostly Hungarian, and with Hungarian Jewish owners, proprietors. In the summers, they went out to the waterfront. They went out to the big resort hotels along the shores of Brooklyn and Staten Island. The center image was from a restaurant called Joel's Bohemia, run by a guy named Joel Rinaldo. That's not his real name. I just met one of his descendants when I gave this talk at noon today at the U of L. One of his descendants was there, and she said, we have no idea where they got Rinaldo from. They were Polish Jewish immigrants, no idea how they picked that name out. Joel Rinaldo. The restaurant was Joel's Bohemia. It was near Times Square. It had portraits of the regulars hanging on the wall. So I bought that postcard on eBay, and when it arrived and I scrutinized it with a magnifying glass, I realized, oh, wait, one of those portraits, it's literally this big in real life, says Zoe Norris. That's the caption on it, with a big black feather in her hair, in her hat. That's the kind of fixture she was of New York nightlife, that her photo, a drawing of her was on the wall at Joel's Bohemia. And this is a fraction of my collection of cutlery, glassware, and china from the Ragged Edgers' favorite restaurants. Because there's nothing, I often say, that brings you closer to the feeling that you're in the presence of the spirit of somebody you've been researching, writing, giving lectures on for years, than to hold a talismanic pickle fork in your hand from a restaurant you know they dined at. And just for this audience, I have snuck a bottle of whiskey bourbon on the right of this table setting. That was made by one of her relatives back in Harrodsburg, a scoundrel named John Burton Thompson, whose brother was the basis for the scoundrel who narrated her novel, her book of short stories, 12 Kentucky Colonel Stories. And I bid on it and I way overpaid. And the other collector was probably actually interested in the history of bourbon and had no idea why this crazy lady in New York was outbidding him. I had to have that. In the 1910s, while running the Ragged Edge Klub, she becomes nationally famous for this. She becomes dubbed the Queen of Bohemia, and she hates that title at first because Bohemia in her time suggested a place where people were willing to live in filth and to indulge all their worst impulses. So a man in Bohemia justified running off with his latest affinity, as lovers were euphemistically called. She had a frenemy who had a house in upstate New York called Affinity Hill. He had run through so many lovers and wives there. But eventually she gets called it so often she just decides to claim it. And she writes in her own magazine, if I'm going to be the Queen of Bohemia, I need a peerage, I need aristocrats. And she begins to use a long-necked Hungarian wine bottle to tap her friends lightly and anoint them with aristocratic titles. And thus is anointed, for example, Lady Betty Rogers of the Bronx, Countess Ella Bosworth of Brooklyn, and Baron Bernhardt of Hoboken. Also in the 1910s, she publishes one more book, a novel, The Way of the Wind. It is about a family from Harrodsburg who try to homestead at the Kansas frontier on land besieged by cyclones, droughts, locusts, terrible isolation, and constant wind, and descend into madness and poverty there and straggle back. What remains of them straggles back to Harrodsburg. It's gorgeously written. You will all recognize the descriptions of the Kentucky landscape in it. It's incredibly sad. She self-publishes it, and very few copies sell. So in the last issue, Jan-Feb 1914 of The East Side, she writes about her recent vivid dream that her long dead mother, Henrietta, who had died in the asylum in Lexington, had come to her bedside on East 15th Street and warned, "You're the next of my many children to die." Zoe writes at this ghost's warning, she shrieked and then she grew relieved. She writes in her own magazine, if this dream comes true, I hope I've done some good for the world by fighting for the poor with my pen. And I want the Ragged Edgers, as she called them, to throng my funeral. And she mails out the issue. She goes to a Ragged Edge Klub dinner. She collapses. She's brought to a charity hospital across Lower 2nd Avenue from the restaurant, where she dies. And the Ragged Edgers do, in fact, throng her funeral. These are the calling cards and condolence cards that her daughter Clarence picked up and saved from the funeral. So in the center, handwritten, big letters, that's from the family of William Oberhart, Zoe's magazine illustrator. Lower right, just up one from the bottom, there's a handwritten browned card. That's from Countess Ella Bosworth of Brooklyn. Halfway down the left-hand column, Libby Arnold Blondell. She put an E at the end of her name on the day she had that business card made up on a whim. And at the top there with a black rectangle on it, that's from Zoe's friend Jack McPike. He was a cigar dealer from Missouri. And that's a card he sent out trying to keep the Ragged Edge Klub going after her death. And it lasted another year or so. The news that the Queen of Bohemia had accurately predicted her own death in her own magazine made headlines in hundreds of newspapers nationwide. Queen of Bohemia Predicts Own Death is the title of my book, and it is not the title she would have wanted on her autobiography of her. But I think she would have wanted any title that got people's attention and had them learn about her fight for the poor with her pen. She wanted to be buried in New York amid the skyscrapers with the windows flashing back the fire of the sun, but her family sent her body by train from New York back to Harrodsburg. She's buried in Spring Hill Cemetery. It's a lovely slope at the outskirts of town. It has no dramatic sculpture or mausoleum architecture. I don't know which tourist has ever come through there one day and wondered why in heaven's name was this stone erected by the Ragged Edge Klub of New York. It says musician, artist, writer on it, and her daughter designed this, and I don't know why her daughter put musician first. She had classical music training, including at Daughter's College, where there's memorabilia from over there. And she did keep up her piano playing skills. She had a rented piano in her New York apartment. She did have art training at Daughter's College. She taught art there briefly. She taught art in Wichita briefly, and she contributed some doodles to the margins, little portraits for her magazine, but that's not what she was known for. Writer is what she would have wanted at the top of the list. I don't know how her daughter made this selection, but I suspect I understand why it has her exact death date, Feb 13th, 1914, and no information about her birth year. Nothing, because I suspect that her friends and family were trying to protect for her, even for the afterlife, the secret of how old she really was. It's even got her death, her age wrong on her death certificate. It says 47. So her legacy, and barreling towards the end here, really looking forward to the Kentucky lens expert questions here. Her legacy. That's her grandson on the left, Robert Morris. The Bam, she called him. The Bambino, she called him. That was his nickname. He went on to be an admiral during World War II, and was, there's many people in Harrodsburg who remember Admiral Robert Morris. He helped lead the armada that landed American forces on the coasts of France, the Mediterranean coast of France and Italy, and free them from Nazi control. He also had the common sense to marry a member of the Ball family, the fabulously rich Indiana philanthropists. And so his in-laws put up that brick Georgian steepled church over, or federal, over the cabin where Abraham Lincoln's parents were married. Anybody who's been to Harrodsburg and seen that cute little cabin, but in this grand space, that was built by his fabulously wealthy in-laws. Her daughter Clarence and Clarence's second husband, Fletcher Chelf, who was a seed company owner, they had a daughter named Mary, born years after Zoe's death, who became a globe-trotting soprano and then eventually retired to Harrodsburg. She became fascinated by the story of the grandmother she never knew. She drafted a book about Zoe that she never published, which was incredibly helpful for my research. And she founded the Ragged Edge Theater on the main drag in Harrodsburg, where it thrives to this day. She had no will, she had no possessions of value, but what she did bequeath us all is a great story. I own more of her work in print, I suspect, than she ever did. And more of it keeps surfacing. I had handed in my manuscript to my editors. It had gone out for peer review when something that I'd never seen before surfaced on eBay. The August 1907 issue of a magazine that I knew she'd contributed to, but I'd never seen it on the market and no library owned it. $44, buy it now. And I do think that her spirit is guiding me to eBay because she definitely wants to be written about for having written about writing about writing. And finally, her illustrator, William Oberhart, I tracked down his descendants in rural Maryland. He went on to enormous fame. He illustrated, for example, the first covers of Time magazine in the 1920s. They had an attic full of his papers, boxes stacked to the ceiling, and including a mass of material, lithographs, proofs, ephemera, photos related to Zoe, the Ragged Edge Klub, and the East Side magazine. They donated everything, bless them, to New York Historical Society, but New York Historical sensibly wouldn't take the lithograph stones. There were 2 or 3 left in family hands. They're beastly heavy. The family kept the 1 or 2, and I took this one because lower left, that's a portrait of Zoe that appeared in the East Side magazine just before her death. That stone tore through 3 tote bags on the Amtrak ride back from Maryland to New York, but I had to get it back to New York where Zoe felt most at home. And finally, on the right, that's me a few years ago in front of her building when I was just getting started on this Zoe journey that has brought me here today. I'm holding up a cheap reprint of her magazine, The East Side. On the left-hand page is one of her best poems. I have copies available as souvenirs if anyone wants it. It's called The Song of the Typewriter. And the refrain is now, work, damn you, work. That's what I'm holding up. Again, souvenir copies for anyone who asks. And on the right-hand page is Zoe wrapped in shawls, playing the accordion and playing, of all things, on the Lower East Side, pretending to be an immigrant beggar, my old Kentucky home. Thank you so much for listening. I've gone way over time. Thank you all for listening. Really looking forward to questions, comments.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions? You have a question?
Oh, wait for the mic, Kristen.
So you did all these years of research, and there's obviously an extraordinary amount of information that you've given us just in half an hour. What were some of your favorite things that you had to leave out of the book?
Oh, wow. So Kristen, I managed to cram in a little crumb of virtually everything. But so many cool things have happened since the book came out, even with more relatives surfacing. And now you're going to laugh. I've been writing about having written this book. So I've actually got an article coming out in the magazine, the Quarterly of the Ephemera Society of America. Do I see any card-carrying members of the Ephemera Society of America? I've literally written a long article that's going to go in my collection of articles about Zoe, which is about how collecting this material made my book better and also made my illustrations better. So there's going to be a sequel, which is all about how much fun I'm having giving talks like this.
You mentioned she was estranged from her son who became successful. Did you get any type of sense of what type of mother she was?
So I know that as the wife of a man who cheated on her in a gossipy frontier town, she was a very unhappy person. I think she was able to suppress that to some extent. There's lots of Wichita reports of her taking her children to concert, turning her children into performers, hand-making costumes for them, throwing lavish birthday parties for them, escorting them everywhere. She almost never writes about women who have sons. She almost never writes about mother-son relationships. I think that the cut off from him was deeply painful to her. And yet I know why he stopped speaking to her. Not only did she leave Wichita suddenly and was gone for at least 2 years when he was between maybe ages 18 and 20. She just fled the town. He barely knew where she was for several years. When he got engaged to this is in my book, he got engaged to a provincial girl in Wichita. And Zoe wrote a short story about a woman from New York who goes back to the an unnamed provincial Western town where her son has stayed and is about to marry an unsophisticated girl and tries to break up the marriage and fails and then blesses them. This is a horrible story to have written about your own child. It's based on real life. I know that in one letter in Family Hands, she mentions that by 1909, she doesn't even have his address. But she adored her daughter. Madonna con bambino, she called her daughter and her grandson. She writes vividly about motherhood and her anger at men who abandon families, specifically because a maternity is for eternity, she wrote. And she admired the Lower East Side women who sacrificed everything. She vividly describes following around a visiting nurse and going to a tenement where a woman is passing out from starvation, but her radiantly healthy baby is on the table like a centerpiece. So she was a really complicated mother. Thank you for asking that question.
We do have a couple of questions online. Zoe sounds so far ahead of her time. How did she come to that bold stance herself?
So I think once she divorced her husband, which was a huge break with what would have been expected from a Kentucky belle, once she broke that expectation, she just kept defying them. She just, once that sort of shell fell off, she thought, oh, now anything's possible. I can go to Europe. I can roam around Europe by myself. I can write about it. I can come back to New York. I can self-publish if I want. I can insult people I know in print. I think once she broke one barrier, she just kept going to see how many barriers. In that book about Daughters College, that's right over there, you'll see it, not that it's openable, but it's digitized. I'll send you the link if you're curious about what her high school education was like. She was specifically told in high school, keep quiet, don't seek fame, don't be a purposeless bejeweled butterfly, do works of charity, do not seek the applause of the world. Vividly in print. Once you broke that, let's just keep going.
We have another one. How did you get interested in Zoe's life and decide to write about her?
Oh, thank you. So hang on. I just want to give you the visuals for this. So my mother's parents and her aunts and uncles were immigrants from Ukraine before the immigration laws changed in the 1920s. They were all here basically before World War I. My mother's parents and aunts and uncles would have been walking the same streets that Zoe Anderson Norris saw. She went out to Ellis Island. She saw Jewish deportees in a cage. They were deemed either too young or too old. They were in their 50s, too old to earn a living in America. They were deemed LPC, which stands for likely public charge. She went out to Ellis Island. She saw deportees in a cage who were you didn't get sent back to your crummy hometown in Ukraine when you got deported in 1910. You got sent back to wherever the steamship had left from. So you got dropped back in Antwerp or Hamburg or Southampton and somehow had to find anyone who cared about you. Your hometown all the Jews had left your hometown. So she wrote sympathetically about my own ancestors. It's my ancestors who were walking past this lady playing my old Kentucky home on the Lower East Side streets. A friend of mine he collects magazines, and he showed me her magazine in the fall of 2018. And I looked through and I thought, who's this woman writing so sympathetically about my own ancestors that I've never heard of?
I think we have time for one more, if there's one more question.
Christian, thank you. So people ask, and one of my FAQs is, I often get asked actually specifically, what government reforms was she responsible for? And the answer is she couldn't vote, let alone advocate for specific reform. She knew a lot of reformers who focused their entire lives basically on reform. There are a couple of writers that were in her circle that I know she influenced. There was a woman named Sophie Irene Loeb, who became not only a writer, but also, and she ended up running a child welfare advocacy group. Sophie Irene Loeb wrote vividly about how we need to stop breaking up families when they fall into poverty. We need to try and keep them together rather than send the kids off to some inhumane orphanage. Yeah, Sophie Irene Loeb was one person she interviewed. She also had a friend named Lita Kildare, who invented so much about her life, but also wrote really vividly about life in the slums. And she had a friend named Mabel Herbert Erner, who also wrote really vividly about broken marriages, particularly, and scoundrel men. So I can trace particular people who inherited her literary mantle. And thank you for that question. Thank you all for coming. I'd love to sign some books. If anybody wants to join me, that's